Good day, good day, good day. It is a beautiful Tuesday, December the 1st, but it is cold. It is cold. Officially Christmas season, though. And so, welcome to another Tuesday with Tom, brought to you by the Best Girl Consulting Firm. Best Girl consults with utilities, higher ed institutions, associations, and large nonprofits to customize solutions that support your bottom line. It's the Christmas season. The bell ringers are out. Christmas decorations are already up in some homes. Christmas music is filling the airways, and Christmas movies are streaming and filling up the network time. What's your favorite Christmas movie? I'll tell you my top three. Number one, It's a Wonderful Life. Number two, It Happened on Fifth Avenue. And number three, A Christmas Story. The Boy and the BB Gun. That's a story. That's a personal story for me. I love Christmas. Christmas motivates me. Christmas motivates many and most of us to be nice, to do for others, and to share. The man or woman ringing that bell, standing beside the Real Salvation Army kettle. We feel good when we drop something in that kettle. So feel good. We will celebrate Christmas. We will celebrate it safely. Just pull your mask up, keep your distance, and drop your contribution in the bucket. I'm going to enjoy Christmas. I enjoy every Christmas. I celebrate Christmas. Sometimes I celebrate Christmas every day. Why not? When I think back over the years, it was fun as a child to get toys, man, to go outside and everybody's got on new shiny stuff and new bicycles and skates. It was just wonderful. As I grew older, hopefully wiser and more celebratory of myself, I didn't need as many things. And I'd like to see the joy in the eyes of others, especially the young people. So in the spirit of giving and love, let's not focus so much this year on how different this Christmas will be. But the fact that it is Christmas, no matter how different it will be, but the fact that it's Christmas, it will be Christmas. It's the season for sharing, loving, giving. So be motivated to be safe. Have safe fun, safe travel, and enjoy. And as I always say at the end of every show, make every day count, even during a Christmas pandemic. So just a word about the upcoming shows. We're going to try to hit Christmas throughout the month of December. Next week, we have Ann Tucker, who's the former chairwoman of the Tribal Council at Muskogee Nation of Florida. The Muskogee Nation is survived from the Creek Indians, who were in Alabama and moved down to Northwest Florida. We'll talk about that. On December 15th, we're going to have what I call the reunion show. I get to reunite with guys I played ball with: Mitzi Jackson, Cedric McIntyre, Sullivan Walker, Reese McCall. And with the exception of James Owens, these men were the only black men to play for Auburn football coach Shug Jordan. Shug Jordan, of course, coached at Auburn for 25 years, is in the Hall of Fame, had a Heisman Trophy winner, won a national championship, and in some respects led the way to integration in the Southeastern Conference. So we'll have these guys on. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun. I haven't seen Sullivan in maybe 30 years, and so this will be a heck of a reunion. And then on December 22nd, Santa Claus will be here along with some Christmas caroling. Maybe we can get Eric Jones to come back and give us a history of some of your favorite Christmas songs. So, and also December 22nd is another audience participation day. So be prepared to contact us regarding your favorite Christmas and what your safe plans are for this year and your favorite Christmas movie. So today, Barbara Wallace Edwards and Michael Walker are here. Our G-list guest today is from the University of Alabama in Birmingham. No, not that one in Tuscaloosa, the one in Birmingham. We're not talking about football right now, although we can in a few minutes. I'll deal with that when we get to our G-list. But our G-list guest is Dr. Paulette Patterson Dilworth. She is the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. So our two roundtable guests are Barbara Wallace Edwards and Michael Walker. Barbara Wallace Edwards, as you all know, is a world traveler, a big shopper. We were just having a shopping discussion before we came on. And we always look forward to having Barbara. Good morning, Barbara.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Feeling better.
You were a little under the weather last week.
I
You better
was.
now?
I'm feeling much better. I went to take the COVID test. Thank God it was negative. So this was just a respiratory infection I was dealing with, and I am feeling much, much better. Still got a little ways to go. Still hadn't been outside at all. Just got my results back last night, actually. So I've been confined to the house, self-quarantine for the last week. And so I'm excited to say I can finally get out of the house and go somewhere today. I may just ride around the block and do nothing else. So it's been awful, confined by myself for 1 week. I don't think I've ever sat still that long.
Sometimes you just have to get in the car and go for a ride and come around and come back.
Yeah.
And we've got Michael Walker with us. Michael, of course, is with the Walker Insurance Agency. He's from Atlanta, Georgia. He's president of the Walker Agency. I'm sorry. And so, Michael, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well, Tom. Good morning to you, and good morning to you, Barbara, as well. Glad you're doing better. I bet when you got that negative COVID test, you increased by 50% as far as feeling better, didn't you?
You better believe it. I did.
So, right. Michael, what's going on with you?
Well, I got to tell you, I did have a good Thanksgiving. I spent the Thanksgiving holidays up in the North Georgia mountains, away from everything, and just a chill out type holiday, and enjoyed myself with some leisurely activities. I did a little horseback riding, and as a matter of fact, I took a fall from the horse while I was up there, as a matter of fact, well, it was a situation where we're going through the trail. The horse I was on hated to go through the mud and the water. So whenever we came up on a puddle of mud and water, he'd venture off the trail and go around. And so I would let him do that. And we came into an area and the terrain was a little bit uneven and on a slight decline. And so he went around and I think it was a hole or something there. He lost his footing. And when he did that, my weight shifted on the saddle and I started to fall over. And rather than trying to fight it and hold on to the saddle because I felt it's moving, I didn't want to pull the horse down on me. So I just let go and kind of fell off of it and stuff and took a roll on my shoulder, but everything was okay.
Oh, man. Mm.
Yeah. Man. I had to do some quick thinking right there. Do I let go of this saddle and fall off, or do I try and fight and hold on and let it slide over and the horse fall on me? So I chose the former.
Man, last time I was on a horse riding one of those trails, they know the trail. You don't. Right. And this joker, man, he didn't like me or whatever. So he kept running me into the trees. Making me brush up against the trees. And then he just decided he was going to turn around and go back. And so I started jerking. I said, no, you ain't going to get it. And that joker started bucking. I said, okay, well, let's just go back then. It's a ride either way.
Oh, yeah.
That was enough for me. So, all right, I have to ask you guys, give me a summary of the football game.
Ooh. Ooh, it was painful. I actually started watching right before halftime. I couldn't.
When I say the football game, I'm talking about Auburn, Alabama, and what they call Iron Bowl. It isn't Iron Bowl anymore because it's not in Birmingham. But go ahead.
Tom, that was painful to watch. I felt sorry for our players. I really did. They gave it their best shot, I guess, but it was not good. I stopped watching the game right before halftime and waited for someone to tell me what was going on. I went to take a nap.
I hear you. Well, they said they beat us so bad that they didn't even need to bring the coach. They said, well, we'll just play y'all without our coach.
Yeah, Michael, I can only imagine what the would have been if Saban had been there.
Oh, yeah. Michael, you got some comments?
Well, you know how I feel about the Auburn program and the person heading it up. I will just say that I didn't waste my time watching the game. I went to a winery and had a nice dinner and had a nice glass of wine and just forgot that there was a thing called the Iron Bowl because I knew what was going on. I will tell you that one day I was up there. I had on my Auburn hat, and whenever you wear that, people got to stop and talk to you. So I was getting breakfast, and this elderly couple called me over, and the guy says, "Did you hear? You know that Nick Saban's not coaching." I said, "Yes, I heard that." He says, "Well, Gus Malzahn said he's only going to dress 6 players, and the other 46 will have to dress themselves for the game." I didn't really get the joke, but I looked at him and laughed.
I ain't either.
I looked at him and laughed, and I said, "Well, I wish Gus wouldn't dress himself. Maybe we can leave him at Auburn." So that was my response, and they laughed at that.
Yeah, that's I don't get that one at all.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit of Christmas before we move on. So either one of you got a favorite Christmas movie?
I'm like you, Tom. I like The Christmas Story. That's one of my favorites. And I don't really watch a lot of movies, but that's one of my favorites.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay.
I guess
Ralph.
I have to say Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I've always liked that because Rudolph was the outcast. He was thought of not having much value or worth, and it ended up he was the one that was a hero. So I like Rudolph. So that's my all-time favorite.
Okay. You guys, if you get a chance this Christmas, you got to watch It Happened on Fifth Avenue. It's really cool. It's this homeless guy and his little dog, and there's this rich family that has this mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York. But during the winter months, they go to their spring home down in South somewhere, North Carolina, Virginia, somewhere like that, and they stay there for the spring and summer months. Well, when they go there, this homeless guy moves into their home in New York and stays there. He's got a way to get in. Nobody knows he's there. And so he lives there for the 3 months that they're gone. And then when they come to that house, he goes to their other house and he lives in the other house. It's a great story. It's a great story. So
I'll have to get that one.
Yeah, you gotta get that one. And I'll tell you a little quick story. I read yesterday I was reading about Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra played for the Yankees, and he has all these crazy sayings, and he always say, "I didn't really say everything I said." And so he's talking about he's checking out of this hotel, and he says, "Man, this hotel has the best towels. They're just thick and fluffy." He says, "Shoot, I could hardly get my suitcase closed." Anyway, I thought that was cute.
That is
So
cute.
let's do a sponsorship commercial for Best Girl, and then we're gonna go to our G list and get with our special guest. So, Emily, roll the Best Girl spot, please, man. Today's show is sponsored by Best Girl Inc. What is Best Girl? Best Girl is a consulting firm that provides customized leadership, access and inclusion, public relations, communications, and organizational consulting services. Our clients include Fortune 500 companies, utilities, higher education institutions, small businesses, and associations. We have a team of consultants led by Joyce Gilly Gossom and Miss Emily Hedrick, and they partner with business and education business clients to promote organizational effectiveness and education, motivation, and leadership. Our customized consulting services include strategic planning, corporate communications, executive coaching, fundraising, and some economic development. All right, well, let's go to the G list. The G list is where everybody is a star. Hollywood has the A list, and here on Tuesdays with Tom, we have the G list. And our G list guest today is Dr. Paulette Patterson Dilworth. She's Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. She was faculty and assistant vice president for Access and Community Initiatives at Auburn University. And before that, she was professor of curriculum studies in the School of Education at Indiana University in Bloomington. She has a strong affinity for art and music, and she's accumulated several years of experience in higher education. I never say those numbers of years that people put in there. So I always just say several. My mom told me a long time ago, she said, quit telling people how old you are.
That's right.
They don't know how old I am. So anyway, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for having me. This is really a treat
Well,
to join you this morning.
we're excited to have you. I want to start off in diversity.
Yes.
Diversity has sort of become one of those words that people put their own definition to. And so could you tell me how you define diversity? And not necessarily, and even in terms of your job, but just how you define it in itself.
Well, that's a great question to start with, Tom, because I think that therein lies the confusion with a lot of this work sometimes, is the ill-conceived ideas about diversity. But I define diversity as simply all of those things that come together to create the human experience, whether it's our physical qualities, our demographic qualities in terms of geography, where we come from, our perspectives, our ideas. But more importantly, what we need to be able to make a distinction about is diversity and inclusion, because I think that even if you're in a room full of people who look like each other, there's still diversity present within that group of people. And so what does it mean then to work to make an organization more inclusive, or working within that space to make sure that everybody's voice is being heard and equally valued at the same time? And that's sort of a simple way to talk about it.
Okay, let me ask you this. You say you can have people who all look alike and they can be different. Can you also have people who don't look alike, but there's a monoculture to the situation? And
Absolutely.
so you've got people of color, you've got other people, but the culture is a monoculture. If that
Absolutely.
makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think for me, I have spent majority of my higher education career working in predominantly white institutions, with the exception of my experience at one HBCU. For those of you listening, HBCUs are the historically Black institutions. And one of the things that makes a distinction is even within an HBCU, and it's really funny because I had this conversation with my son just the other day, who basically started out at an HBCU, but transferred to a PWI because the culture at the HBCU was overwhelming for him. And I asked him, I said, well, what was different about that culture that you did not connect with in terms of, and he said, well, for me, it was the realization that all of the people in the room looked like me, but I thought I was the sharpest knife in the drawer. What I realized was that there were a lot of sharp patrons out there. And at the PWI, of course, it became a different reality, because then he realized that and this is the monocultural piece, I think that we struggle with at PWIs, is because the experience around monoculture is so deeply ingrained based on traditions. Who created it, for whom, and for what purpose? And understanding that those are the challenges that you encounter in monocultural environments.
How do you deal with, and you just struck a nerve with me when you talked about traditions, because if you and I PWIs, that's a new one for me, but thank you. When you talk about traditions, particularly at a predominantly white institution, most of the time, particularly in the South, those traditions did not include
Absolutely.
people who look like me.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
That is probably the question for the 21st century,
Okay.
because ultimately, and especially in the South, but not just the South, even with our highly ranked Ivy League institutions, the majority of our higher education institutions were built on the strength of slave labor and the institution of slavery. And so those institutional histories are embedded in that. And so while our folk basically helped to develop those institutions, the traditions that evolved for them excluded us having the opportunity to have a seat at the table. And so to talk about that from the standpoint of traditions, I remember, I think at your alma mater, you know, they had the Old South Parade, which it took a long time to dismantle that experience. But it's those kinds of things that happen for which, and then something else that you and I worked on together, the commemoration of integration at Auburn, which happened in 1964. Although Brown versus Board of Education became law in 1954, the institutions in the South were very slow to respond to that mandate. And so what you had was all of the higher educations institutions in the South taking their time to actually admit Black students in particular. And so it's that, when you say the tradition and how we start to dismantle both policies that have been exclusive, hiring practices that have been exclusive, a promotional practice, even, and I think most higher education institutions, and this is not just unique to Southern institutions, the diversity of our faculty is one of the foremost concerns that we have right now. We are admitting students in record numbers at some of these institutions, but it's likely that they might take a class having never been taught by a person of color. And so it's that kind of experience that is creating the work that has to be done.
I think that's very interesting, because I can go back to when I was in college, and we're talking 40, 50 years now. And I had classes. I never had a class with a person of color in terms of the instructor or faculty or what have you.
Well, you're a pioneer, Thom.
But for that to happen today,
yeah,
it's almost unforgivable.
That's right.
It's incredible. Let me ask you a couple more questions. We're gonna get Barbara them on.
Sure.
When you talk about diversity, and then people get sidetracked and start talking, well, you know, we're not for quotas and all that. How do you measure diversity? How do you measure the success of a program?
Success of the program. So I think the first thing that you need to prioritize is, number one, with this question that you started with, how are we defining diversity, and what does that look like at the institution? And then think very strategically about what the priorities need to be. And so I think one of the most important questions is to ask is, how are people getting access to our institution? Who's allowed to walk in the door? And once they get in the door, what's the experience that they have here? Are they able to be successful as a student, or if they're a faculty or a staff member? Are they able to be successful? Who's getting promoted? Who's getting rewarded for doing good work? Those kinds of things. And then that becomes part of the numbers. Also, at the same time, what are you doing to change the climate, to make sure that people do feel comfortable, that they are welcome? When you walk into a building, do you see only pictures of sort of the founding people? Or, as in our case, you know, Alabama is one of the seats of the Confederacy. And so there are lots of Confederate, I guess, images and things like that would suggest to people that when these things happen, it didn't happen with you in mind. So when we talk about that in light of measuring success, it takes into consideration both the numbers and the quality of the experience that people have. And there are ways to measure that. For us, we've just recently completed a campus climate survey 2 years ago with our students. And we've also done some engagement measures with our faculty and our staff. And then looking very strategically at our hiring practices and our promotion practices now, and even retention practices, and making sure that we continue to advance those as priorities throughout the institution.
How important are the students in the whole diversity issue? Some campuses, students are more aggressive, I guess is a word, than others.
Yes.
How important is this?
I think that that's the most important, because it's kind of like they say, the children are watching. A lot of them may not say anything, but they're certainly paying attention. And as an example, right after George Evans was murdered, Tom, we got, I guess, avalanche it was a triggering experience for students, or a lot of them who reached out to us. And so I, one of the people on my staff, Dr. Michelle Allen, who is our director of diversity education, spent some time doing focus groups with a lot of our students and some of the academic units. And we learned a lot from listening to the students about their experiences at UAB, and particularly in the classroom. And so for that reason, and the good news is that those units have been very responsive in trying to make sure that the concerns that students raise are being addressed in important ways. And one of the things that came out, for example, was the example that, I've been at this institution for X number of years and have yet to have a course that's been taught by a person of color.
Wow.
Or when the incident with George Floyd happened, I was at some of the, I guess, the demonstrations that were about to occur. The student reached out to a faculty member to say, "I won't be in class," and the only thing the faculty member said was, "Thank you." I mean, and they're not saying, "Are you okay?" or "Is there anything I can do?" or just showing a little bit more concern about the fact that students were having some triggering and emotional experiences, and a lot of anxiety around some of the things that were happening at the time.
You've been at several universities, including an HBCU.
Right.
What works and what doesn't work?
So you know what, Tom,
Yeah.
I am so biased, really. So because I went to an HBCU myself, and I have to give you a little bit of background in terms of understanding how I feel this way, because I was one of 6 young people who integrated the high school in Selma. And that experience was very emotional and anxiety inducing, to spend 3 years in a culture, number one, that was never really intended for you to be in the space. And then to question whether or not you were capable of doing the work. And so when I chose the HBCU and landed there, it was probably the most, how can I say, it was really a holistic experience, because what I saw were people who looked like me in charge, people who looked like me, who were very smart, and building up people who came in like me, who basically others had said, "Well, we're going to write you off because we really don't think that you can do this." And then realizing, and we have an expression, if you can make it at an HBCU, you can make it anywhere. And so for that reason, I think I'm a little biased, but there is a difference. And there's something to be said about being totally submerged in your culture. There's just something to be said about that. And so submerged in that culture that you don't have to question, well, is this valid? Or are they doing this simply because we raised the protest and now they're trying to respond to that protest?
Okay. Let me get, I think we've got some people here that want to say hello to you.
Oh, okay.
AUCBA, the Black Alumni at Auburn, still and always love Dr. Dilworth. We love you, Doc.
Yeah. I miss my Auburn family too.
I hear you. Best girl, Joyce says hello.
Tell her I said hi.
Okay. All right. And Brandon Wolf. You remember Brandon?
I do. Brandon is there at UAB with me. Is he watching?
Oh, he says, hey, yeah, he's watching.
Yeah. And Anita Clement is watching too. Do you know
Anita Clement? Yes.
Yeah. Ivory. Hi, Ivory.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, great. Good deal.
Those are folk, and I have the best team ever, Tom. And I will tell people that every day. Yeah.
That's good.
It works because I have great, smart people working in the unit.
Good morning, Kevin. That's my cousin, Kevin.
Okay. Hi, Kevin.
Yes. Let me bring Michael and Barbara in, and I'm sure they've got some questions, and then I'll come back. Barbara.
Hi, Barbara. She frozen.
Hi, Dr. Dilworth. How are you doing this morning?
I am great. It's great to
Can you
see
hear me
you.
okay?
Where's your shopping bag?
Great. It's good. In the trunk of my car. Believe me, I'm going out today. I'm going to do some shopping. I've been inside for a whole week and didn't get to do any Black Friday shopping either. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, I'm about to get out today and hopefully do a little bit of shopping. But
Yeah.
I'm so excited about what you're doing here at UAB. We miss you at Auburn, and we wish you were back there. I can really say that. We really
Yeah.
miss you.
Yeah.
And I know that at UAB, you have the student population there. I think you have over 43% of the student base is from underrepresented groups. That's just phenomenal numbers. And what recommendations do you have for other PWIs as to how they can get there? What are some of the things that you're doing at UAB that they should be implementing right now at other PWIs and
Sure. Well, I think we assume that we know what our students want and need, but I think one of the most important things that you can do is spend some time talking to students about, and then thinking of ways to involve them. One of the things that I like about working at UAB is that it is a very collaborative institution. And so when we put together committees or groups to work on particular projects, typically there will be students included on that committee, and their voices are valued, and we use the input from students, to make as part of the decision-making process. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of institutions, I mean, I've worked at some where that hasn't always been the case, but if institutions are there and we say that our students are important, just as our faculty and our staff are, we need to show them that they are important.
Absolutely. Thank you. I find that true, especially at Auburn. That is definitely true. They place them on the committee, but their voices are not being heard.
Oh, yeah. Well, that really, it's a missed opportunity if you don't listen to students.
I agree.
Michael?
I agree totally.
Yes. Good morning, Dr. Dilworth.
Good morning.
It's a
How are
pleasure
you?
to have you.
Thank
I'm
you.
well, thank you. I have several questions, but the first one that I want you to shed a little light on is to expound on the difference between diversity and inclusion. Because whenever we see the phrase, it says diversity and inclusion. Would you expound on that, please?
Sure. So I think and this is one explanation that you may have heard already, but imagine receiving an invitation to the dance, and you show up at the dance, and there are all kinds of people in the room, international, Black people, white people, Asian, and then you look out on the dance floor. The only people dancing are the white people, right? Or only people dancing are the Asian people. And then you wonder, well, why is that the case? If those are the only people on the dance floor. So who extended the invitation? Did the invitation say that you can come to the dance, you just don't get to dance? But inclusion has to do with, once you show up at the dance, not only do you get an invitation to dance, but you actually have the opportunity to dance if you so choose to. And that's the difference between diversity and inclusion, is that we often talk about diversity in terms of representation, but the representation does not translate to action. So what does that mean to have diversity at an institution, but your actions suggest that you're giving lip service to the diversity component? So even going back to a committee, when you're making very important decisions about, say, for example, curriculum, who's on the curriculum committee, who's sitting at that table to talk about the kinds of courses and learning experiences that are going to be created for students? And if that committee is an all-white committee, or say slanted, then it's likely that when we talk about topics like African American studies, Asian studies, Latinx studies, or others, that those won't become a part of the conversation, and thus limits the parameters of a curriculum that way. And so inclusion is actually about making sure that decisions, when they're made, are inclusive, and that people are there who basically represent a diverse spectrum of the people that you serve. And particularly, what I always say, people ask me this question sometimes, so what's the goal for faculty diversity? And I say, well, I don't want to give you a false sense that there's some magical number out there that we want to reach, because there isn't. But what I do know is that we have, say, as Barbara said, 25% African-American student body. Our faculty representation ought to be at least 25% diversity in terms of African-American faculty. So we want to reach parity. We want to reach parity with our student body. And I think that that at least gives us some sense of reality when we work towards something that is much more achievable than saying, well, we want to bring 20 African-American faculty in by 2021, when it's not necessarily the most realistic way to think about it. But to go back to your question, the difference between diversity and inclusion is, to me, very simple. You may have heard this expression too: if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, right? And
Right.
what that means is that you can have these conversations absent the people that you're making decisions about. And those decisions sometimes were not always decisions that are made with your best interest in mind.
Right. Okay. Absolutely. In keeping in that same vein, you've worked at several institutions, prominent institutions like Emory, Auburn. You were at Indiana. You're now at UAB.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, what's the most challenging aspect of trying to implement diversity and inclusion at universities like that?
I think that's a great question, because we talk about challenges and we also talk about opportunities. But most of the times, what I find is that the people who support our work, it's kind of like preaching to the choir. We don't necessarily need to get them on board, because they want to do the things that need to be done to change the institution, to address traditions and practices that are sort of representing barriers. So it's the people who basically do not see this work as important or necessary, or not necessarily interested in seeing things change, or don't feel that there is a need to make room for diversity type programs or initiatives, because it goes back to the point where we talk about, we now live in a post-racial society, but our experiences suggest to us that that is not the case. And so this work does need to be done, and there does need to be focused effort in terms of making sure that our organizations are representative of the citizens in this country, and that everybody has a fair shake. And I think, to respond to that question, it is the continued, I would call it, conversion of the people who are not necessarily allies at this point.
Okay. Okay.
And some people would even argue, well, don't worry about them, but that sometimes can be a challenge, because also leads to some gatekeeping around some of the work that needs to be done. And so how do you get around those people who insist on being gatekeepers?
Right.
Okay, Michael, is that it for you?
Well, I have one more, and
Okay.
this is, could you tell me a little bit about the commission you served on, which was involving the status of Black males? And
In Bloomington?
yes.
Oh, okay, sure. That was a really, I guess I could say, powerful experience. But interestingly enough, the commission was established by an Indiana House of Representative person. It was approved by the governor in the state of Indiana at that time, who, his name escapes me, but he's now president at Purdue. And what he did was, they established a fund that allowed cities in the state of Indiana to get funding from the state to establish local commissions to work on, to establish their own local commissions to address issues associated with Black males. And so it was a state policy, I guess is what I'm suggesting. And the Commission on the Status of Black Males in Bloomington worked on a variety of concerns. Now, keep in mind that the whole state of Indiana at that time was approximately 8% American. So there was a limited presence of African Americans, but the concern was that the cities were doing everything that they could to ensure that Black males were getting a fair shake, both in terms of their experiences in the cities where they lived and opportunities to move beyond their circumstances. So it was, I guess you could think of it really as an outreach effort, sort of like the 100 Black Men of America, but really more infused within the city government experiences. So the police were a part of it. Our criminal justice system people were a part of it. And it was just a very holistic way to think about how can we help Black men in this community.
Interesting.
Cool.
But it was a state policy. I think that went a long way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brandon's got a question. Barbara, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but Brandon's got a question here. And Brandon says, you see it?
I see it. What are some of the most pressing? Yeah. What are some of the most pressing challenges facing DEI in higher education? And I think I've addressed one that I see, and that is the sometimes the gatekeeping that can happen around some of the work that has to happen. And then I think the other is the lack of resources that are often allocated for DEI support, whether it's with, being able to hire the expertise that you need in terms of people who basically think about it. So, if you think about the organization of higher education in terms of academic affairs, student affairs, athletics, and then administrative support where you have facilities, policing, and all those other areas, DEI sometimes is thought of as an add-on program. And I think that what really needs to happen is to see that as just as important as student affairs and academic affairs, so that when it comes to allocating resources, those resources are provided to such programs in the same manner that they're provided for your academic and student affairs components. Okay. And I would say that those are probably the most challenging at this point.
Okay. I think Joyce has a comment here. Do you say it says so important to work with the current climate of an organization and guide it to where it needs to be through the initiatives like the ones Paulette describes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I agree. And we enjoy working with you too, Joyce.
Really Barbara, you got anything further?
Yeah, I do. And Brandon sort of asked the same question, but I just wanted to ask in regards to, I know you worked at universities in both urban and rural areas. Do you see the challenges as being different at those different type universities? And if so, what are those different challenges and how do you address those?
Yeah, so I think if I have to think of a rural experience, Indiana University is located in Bloomington, Indiana, which, but for Indianapolis, I'm not sure that, Indiana is really a pretty rural state. And so a lot of the students that I encountered at Bloomington were students who'd never been out of the state of Indiana. And I found it very interesting. So a lot of the topics that we covered in some of the classes that I taught, particularly when it came to Black people, for example, and I would ask the students, well, where did you learn that information? Oh, I used to watch The Cosby Show, or I used to watch some show that was on TV. And I was like, and there are no Black people in my community. And so ultimately, that was their thinking, or thinking about, keeping in mind that I work with students who are interested in going in the classroom to teach high school U.S. history, social studies, economics courses like that. And when I would talk to them about creating curriculum that was inclusive in terms of content and things like that, they might ask questions around, well, why would I want to do that? Because I'm going back to my hometown and there are no people in your hometown that look like you. They all look like me. And so what does it matter? And so that whole idea of getting them to understand that the world is not just white, it is a black and white. And now it's really much more diverse than that. And so in order for you to see yourself as a teacher who can make curriculum accessible to all students. You have to change the way you think about that. And those were the kinds of things from a professional faculty standpoint that I saw. But then the pieces associated with being in a community where there is a limited presence of people who look like you is just a challenge in and of itself. And being the only, I spent probably more than 50% of my career, well, 90% really of my career in PWIs, and to a certain extent was the only in a lot of the roles that I had. I was the only in my department at Indiana. And so, you become that person that students of color seek out, sometimes. I remember one day I was sitting in my office and I snuck into my office because it was a day off. I didn't have to teach and I was trying to get some writing done. And I heard this knock on the door. It was a very light knock on the door. And they wouldn't go away. And so finally I got up and I answered it. And it was one of my students. And I said, "But how did you know I was in my office?" He said, "Well, I put my ear to the door and I could hear your keyboard. So I knew you were in there typing or something." But, and that was the kind of thing that happens sometimes. Students always sought you out, and here's the thing that I want people to hear too. A lot of folk complain, well, we have to do the heavy lifting when it comes to our students or students who look like us, but I don't mind doing that because I think that, the whole notion of when you get to a certain position in life, you don't pull the ladder up behind you. You leave the ladder down so that other people can find their way up too. And that was the idea. And so I did spend a lot of time counseling, working with students on personal issues, academic issues, and just sort of navigating the institution sometimes. But when you're at institutions that can be isolating that way, I think that's part of the reason why you're planted there.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you.
Just to, I had to do a video for an organization, and within the context of that video was this language that I was supposed to read, but the language was very narrow, and I think and I changed it. I said, let me make this more diverse. They said, well, this doesn't have anything to do with Black people, white people. I said, diversity isn't just about that. It's a culture. And Malcolm Forbes has managing a diverse workforce is a process, not a destination.
Absolutely.
And I think people think, well, when we get to this point, we'll be a diverse organization.
Right. And that's why I am always hesitant to give people, well, how many Black faculty do we need to hire? Because there is no magical number. I mean, this is a process. And what happens is, and I often use Emory as an example. When I arrived at Emory back in 1985, I was one of maybe three in an administrative, maybe directive level at that point. And I was sitting in my office with my boss at the time, who was an African-American man. And I asked him, I said, "So Bob, what's changed at Emory?" And he looked at me and he said, "Paulette, look around you." He says, "What do you see?" I said, "What do you mean? What do I see?" He said, "Do you remember what this place looked like when you first got here?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, it's changing. And it's changing. And don't you see more people who look like you now?" And I was like, "I do." He said, "Well, that didn't happen by chance. It happened because of the work that we've been doing." And so the notion around that is, you kind of put your head down, do some good work, and just let the work speak for you. And people will see the difference that it's making over time.
Is diversity a further embodiment, if that's the right word, of the civil rights movement?
So that's a great question, Tom. And so I don't want to age myself, but there are people who I worked with in the past who would argue that diversity is a soft shoe for the real hard work that really should be done.
Okay.
So saying that to say that the work has evolved.
Okay.
And it may move beyond diversity to something else at this point. But yes, it is an extension of the civil rights movement. It's actually an extension of all of the political, all of the legislation that has been addressed in our Constitution, where people have been extended rights for which, when the framers of the Constitution sat down to write that document, I always use this language because it makes me think, it helps me to stay grounded, to remember that when the framers of the Constitution sat down to draft that document, they fought long and hard about who should be included. And so what that means is, since that time, each generation has been charged with trying to make sure that the Constitution continues to be whole and that it makes allowances for people who are being excluded in whatever ways that we can. Because what we argue is, well, you can legislate behavior, but you can't legislate people's attitudes. But the first thing you do have to do is to address the behavior. And that is sort of, and I would even suggest to people, if you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you might want to take some time to do it. I know that's the teacher in me, but that sort of helps to understand the evolution of all of this and where we are at this particular time in the 21st century, that a lot of the things that we continue to clamor for, we'll probably be clamoring for them in the 22nd century too. And long after a lot of us have been here, but it is very much a civil rights question.
Okay. Michael, Barbara, you got any other questions for?
Well, the one thing I
do
have, okay, go ahead, Barbara.
Now, I was just going to ask, we talked about traditions at some of the schools, and especially PWIs, and of course there were not many of us, or none of us, at the tables when a lot of these traditions were established. And now that some of the institutions have started to try to change these traditions, there's been a lot of upheaval, unrest, and complaining from those who don't look like us, that their history is being lost. How do you explain that? How do you help them to understand that their traditions are hurtful to those who may not look like them, who were at the table when these traditions were established?
I'm smiling because one of the things that came to mind is it just ain't no fun when the rabbit's got the gun, right? But the idea is that history is told from a perspective. An individual, it's told by the writer of that history.
It's
And
story.
right, absolutely.
Story.
And so I need you to stop writing his story or her story and tell our story. And there have been some attempts to do that, and that story has to be inclusive. And I have many times encountered young people in classrooms. Some of the content that I tend to share with young people, and at the end of the semester, they'll come up to me and they'll say, well, Dr. Dilworth, why is it that I just learned this stuff in your class? Why didn't I learn this when I was in high school? And you know what I say to them? You need to go back to your high school and talk to the people at that school in your district, because this is not just the localized problem here at the university. It started early on in your educational process. And so therefore, but the onus is on you to continue to learn. And I think if ever we can help people to understand that, that's why, to me, diversity education is so important, to be able to provide a space where people can have comfortable yet critical conversations about this country, the role of different groups in this country. I often ask the question, so at the time that the white people were here supposedly building a new nation, what were the Black people doing? What were the Asian people doing? What were the Latin people doing? What were the Native American people doing? They didn't just sit quietly and watch all this stuff happen. What was going on? There's a parallel narrative that goes along with those experiences. And so why can't we tell the whole of that story? And to think about, and why is it that they are so invisible in the larger narrative? And to think that if you include those voices in the narrative, how different would that story be?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure.
Michael?
Yes, I have two that kind of overlap. But in your position of diversity and inclusion at a university. In many towns, the university is an economic engine.
Yes.
And we talk often about diversity and inclusion from a standpoint of academics and what have you. But what about the other side of that as far as inclusion and diversity with minority businesses so that they can participate
Sure.
in that economic driver? We don't hear anything about that, and none of the universities seem to have a program that's effective. I like your perspective on that. And then the other one would be UAB being a medical school. Are there any plans to implement equality and inclusion from a healthcare access from that standpoint? And I happen to be in healthcare, so I got to get a question in about healthcare.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, Michael, if you're aware of the project that UAB has right now. I'm going to start with your last question first, okay? And that is the Grand Challenge. Dr. Watts, who is president of UAB, set aside funds, a competitive process for different units on campus to come together to compete for. And the Grand Challenge basically is an opportunity for UAB to be involved in addressing health in the state of Alabama, and primarily health disparities. And I think the goal is healthy Alabama 2030, I believe it is. But the idea is that not only is it addressing making people healthier, because our numbers in that particular area are very low. Comparatively, when we look at Alabama as compared to some of the other southern states, we rank very, very low in the quality of health in the state. And so UAB is taking a very concerted and serious look at what can be done in that particular area to address health disparities, among other things. But it's not just a question that's associated with minorities. It's really about the state as a whole and making sure that we can begin to address healthy ways for people to live in our state. And then the second piece of your question, which asks about minority business support, that is a challenge. And I will admit that we have not made the kind of progress that I'd like to see us make, but that is sort of the next frontier as far as making sure that we are doing our due diligence to make sure that we're working with minority businesses to make sure that they are able to take advantage of the spending opportunities that are here at UAB.
Okay, thank
But
you.
it's a challenge in that regard. I mean, there are a lot of things that, and that maybe is an opportunity to have another discussion at another time about some of the things that I see working with minority businesses, especially when it comes to the back of the house. The front office is one thing, but the back of the house is another. And there's some work that needs to be done in that area, and especially when it comes to doing business with state universities as opposed to private institutions.
There you go.
Where you have all of these, expectations for your business operation and things of that nature.
Also known as barriers.
Yeah, but they still have to be addressed, and that's the reality. Yeah, I mean, you can't.
Right.
I mean, it's like I said. My two sons play baseball, and I always tell them, you got to get your head in the game, and you can't play the game if your head's not in the game. So when you basically say that you're ready to do business, then there's certain things that do need to be in place, and I don't think that we should expect that we would make exceptions in terms of quality, responding to deadlines, things of that nature that say that, I showed up, and not only am I showing up, and I'm showing up to do business.
Sure, agree.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I spoke to a group, and we were talking about the football games on campus. 90,000 people.
Right.
And I said, well, I've been an independent business guy for 30 some odd years. So you know what I see when I go to the stadium and they're playing that game? I see contracts.
Right, absolutely.
I see toilet tissue contracts. I see concession contracts. I see tent contracts. there's so many opportunities, and somehow or another, we have to introduce that idea to the respective leadership, and it's going to take a while, but yeah, that's that the communities that these young men who are playing football come from, that could directly empower those communities if in fact businesses is going in those communities. Anyway, so anybody else, we're going to have to wrap up here. Dr. Dilworth, this has been great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Always good to see you. We had some good times and did some good things together, and hopefully we'll continue to do it.
I was happy to be here. It was nice to meet you, Michael. Take care.
And I still work with the kids. Remember the kids, the Better Basics kids? We still we still work with them, and so yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna close it out with my closing comment. And this is from Tim Cook, the Apple CEO, and he says the world is intertwined today much more than it was when I was coming out of school. Because of that, you really need to have a deep understanding of cultures around the world. I have learned to not just appreciate this, but celebrate this. The thing that makes the world interesting is our differences, not our similarities. So that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank Dr. Dilworth for being with us, Michael Walker and Barbara Wallace Edwards. Thank our sponsor, Best Girl, and thank Emily Hedrick, the communicator, our producer. And that's a wrap. Enjoy yourself. Make every day count. Peace. Today's show